The cold in Wallachia didn't just bite. It buried you standing up. By December 1476, the ground was so frozen that even the dead refused to sink into it. Vlad III sat mounted at the front of a column stretching behind him like a funeral procession. 2,000 soldiers. He could name most of them. He could also name the relatives he'd ordered killed. Every man in that formation owed him either loyalty or revenge. And in Wallachia, those two things were often the same. Official chronicles say he was leading a campaign against an Ottoman raiding party spotted near the southern border. That version is comfortable. That version is also a fabrication. Vlad wasn't chasing anyone. He was being delivered. Marched into position by the very men sworn to protect him, guided toward a killing ground disguised as a battlefield. He was commanding his own funeral escort, and he may have been the only man in that column who didn't know it. Less than a month later, inside a candlelit chamber in Constantinople, a ceramic vessel sealed with dark wax was pried open before the Ottoman Sultan's court. Packed inside, preserved in thick golden honey, was the severed head of the man Europe called the Impaler. His eyes were still open. His mustache was still intact. The Sultan had paid handsomely for that face, but here is the detail that history tried to swallow whole. The blade that separated Vlad's head from his body did not belong to a Turkish soldier. It belonged to someone who had knelt before him, someone who had eaten at his table. The men who killed the Impaler were not invaders. They were insiders, boyars, nobles, men of his own court. This was not a battlefield death. This was a contract killing dressed in chainmail, a medieval execution planned in back rooms and carried out under the cover of a winter campaign that never needed to happen. And when it was done, the conspirators didn't just dump his body and move on. They couldn't afford to. A murdered prince creates questions. Questions create investigations. Investigations create gallows. So they did something far more calculated than concealment. They replaced the man with a myth. They buried the assassination under layers of folklore so thick that 5 centuries later, most people still don't know it happened. They turned a political murder into a vampire story, and the world bought it. This is not a retelling of Dracula. This is the reconstruction of a state-sponsored assassination, the betrayal that made it possible, and the last hours of a man who walked into the wilderness surrounded by traitors and never walked back out. Drop a comment below with the city and country you're watching from right now. Take a moment to subscribe to support the channel. You're watching Ancestral, and this is the darkest history ever told. The architecture of this assassination was not born in a single room or a single season. It was engineered across decades by men whose entire survival depended on the ability to betray at the precise right moment. To understand how Vlad III was delivered to his executioners, you must first understand the organism that consumed Wallachia long before he ever sat on its throne. Forget the romantic portrait of noble lords governing from candlelit chambers. The Boyar Council of Wallachia operated as a syndicate, a cartel dressed in ermine and silver crosses. These men functioned with the cold precision of a modern corporate board managing a hostile territory wedged between 2 imperial superpowers. To the north, the Kingdom of Hungary, a militarized Christian monarchy with an insatiable appetite for buffer states. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, an expanding Islamic war machine that had already swallowed Constantinople and was grinding its way deeper into the Balkans with every passing decade. Wallachia sat directly in the middle of that collision, and the boyars had learned, through generations of blood, that the only way to survive in a corridor of war was to sell yourself to whichever side was winning at any given moment. Their loyalty was seasonal. Their allegiance was transactional. When the Hungarians pushed south, the boyars flew Christian banners and swore oaths to Rome. When the Ottomans surged north, those same boyars knelt toward Mecca and promised tribute. They did not care about borders. They did not care about sovereignty. They cared about commerce. Their fortunes were built on Danube River trade routes, salt mines, and grain exports that flowed regardless of which empire claimed dominion over the territory. Princes came and went. The boyars remained. They were the permanent infrastructure of corruption, and every ruler who sat on the Wallachian throne understood, either through wisdom or through death, that the boyars were the true power in the land. Vlad III was supposed to understand this. When he first claimed the throne, the boyar families expected a controllable instrument. A young prince who had spent years as a hostage of the Ottoman court, broken by captivity, shaped by fear, ready to sign whatever documents were placed before him and collect his modest percentage, while the real business continued uninterrupted. They expected a manager. They received a hurricane. Vlad looked at the boyar council and did not see advisors. He saw a parasitic organism wrapped around the throat of his country, feeding on its blood while selling its sovereignty to foreign courts for profit. He did not attempt reform. He did not propose compromise. He moved to total extermination. And history has spent 500 years misunderstanding the method behind it. The mass impalements that made his name legendary across Europe were not the random acts of a deranged sadist. They were systematic corporate liquidation. Every stake driven into the ground carried a message. Every body raised into the air above the Wallachian plains was a memo sent to every surviving boyar, every foreign diplomat, and every Ottoman commander within riding distance. The message was simple. The old rules no longer apply. The middlemen have been removed. This country now answers to one voice, and that voice does not negotiate. Consider the mechanics of the Easter Massacre of 1459. It remains one of the most surgically brutal political purges in European history, and it was planned with the precision of a military operation. Vlad summoned the most powerful boyar families to his court at Targoviste under the pretense of a religious feast. They arrived adorned in imported silks, accompanied by their wives, their eldest sons, their personal retinues. They expected a banquet. They expected negotiations over taxation rights and trade concessions. They walked through the gates of the citadel believing they were attending a business meeting. The heavy oak doors sealed behind them. Vlad's personal guard, men selected not from the Wallachian nobility but from the lower ranks of the peasantry and foreign mercenary companies, moved into position around the courtyard. What followed was not a feast. It was an industrial operation. The elder boyars, the patriarchs of the most entrenched families, were dragged outside the walls and impaled on greased wooden stakes. The technique was deliberate and horrifyingly refined. The stakes were rounded at the tip, not sharpened, designed to push the internal organs aside rather than puncture them immediately. This ensured the victim remained alive and conscious as gravity slowly pulled their body weight downward, tearing through tissue over a period of hours, sometimes days. They hung in the open air above the road leading into Targoviste, visible to every merchant, every traveler, every foreign envoy approaching the capital. The younger nobles, the sons and nephews who represented the next generation of boyar power, were not killed. They were given a fate designed to be equally instructive. Vlad force-marched them 50 miles north into the Carpathian Mountains. Still wearing their torn feast garments, bleeding from their wrists where the ropes had cut into the skin, they were ordered to build his fortress at Poenari. They carried stones up vertical cliff faces until their fingers cracked open. When they collapsed, they were thrown from the heights. The fortress was built on their bones. It was not construction. It was a monument to the annihilation of the ruling class. The boyars who escaped this purge did not forget. They scattered across the borders into Hungary, into Moldavia, into Ottoman territory, carrying their wealth, their connections, and a hatred so deep it would outlive the generation that bore it. They learned a critical lesson in that courtyard at Targovište. Vlad could not be managed. He could not be bribed. He could not be reasoned with through the traditional mechanisms of aristocratic politics. He operated outside the system they had spent centuries constructing. He was an ideological absolute in a world that ran on compromise and corruption. And for men whose entire existence depended on the flexibility of allegiance, an absolute was the most dangerous thing alive. From that point forward, the boyar network functioned with a single unifying objective. Vlad had to be removed, not replaced, not exiled, destroyed entirely. But they had learned, through the screams of their fathers hanging above the Targovište road, that a direct confrontation was suicide. You do not charge a man who turns your own intestines into public theater. You outmaneuver him. You use paperwork. The first serious attempt to neutralize the Impaler came not through blades, but through ink. In 1462, the surviving boyar faction made contact with King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Matthias was a shrewd, calculating monarch who viewed Wallachia not as a sovereign nation, but as a disposable chess piece in his broader geopolitical strategy against the Ottomans. The boyars presented him with a collection of letters, allegedly written by Vlad, in which the Impaler offered to betray Christendom and form a secret alliance with Sultan Mehmed II. The letters were fabricated, forged with meticulous attention to Vlad's handwriting, his seal, his known diplomatic vocabulary. It was an intelligence operation worthy of any modern spy agency, a manufactured dossier designed to transform an inconvenient ally into a convenient prisoner. Matthias seized the opportunity. He arrested Vlad on the road, confiscated his military assets, and locked him away in the royal complex at Visegrad. The boyars celebrated. The obstacle had been removed without a single sword being drawn. Commerce could resume. The Danube trade routes reopened. Ottoman tribute payments flowed south again without interruption. Wallachia returned to its natural state, a marketplace disguised as a country, managed by men who measured patriotism in profit margins. For 14 years, Vlad III sat in Visegrad. And this is where the story takes a turn that most historians gloss over, because the psychological dimension of his captivity is far more important than the political one. Vlad was not thrown into a dungeon. He was not starved or beaten. Matthias was too sophisticated for crude physical torture. Instead, he gave Vlad a comfortable house, a royal stipend, books, eventually, a wife from the Hungarian nobility. He was allowed to walk the grounds. He was treated, on the surface, like a guest. This was the cruelest punishment imaginable for a man like Vlad. He was forced to sit in comfort while his country burned. Reports reached him regularly. Ottoman raiding parties crossing the Danube unchecked. Wallachian villages torched. The boyars who had betrayed him sitting in his throne room, wearing his crown, eating from his table, signing away his nation's sovereignty one treaty at a time. He could see everything. He could do nothing. He was a predator locked behind glass, watching prey walk past him every day. Accounts from his Hungarian captors describe a man who never fully surrendered to the cage. He caught birds and mice in his quarters and impaled them on tiny wooden splinters. Small creatures pinned to miniature stakes, arranged in neat rows on his windowsill. It was not madness. It was maintenance, He was keeping his hands calibrated, keeping the reflexes sharp, keeping the psychological architecture of the executioner intact, because some part of him understood, with absolute certainty, that the cage would open again. The geopolitical math guaranteed it. Hungary needed him. Not today, not tomorrow. But eventually, the balance would shift, and a comfortable puppet would not be enough. They would need the monster. That moment arrived in 1476. The Ottoman Empire, now under the full momentum of Mehmed the Conqueror's expansionist campaigns, was pressing against the Hungarian frontier with an intensity that Matthias could no longer absorb through diplomacy alone. His compliant boyar regimes in Wallachia were collapsing under the pressure. The men he had installed as puppet princes were negotiators, administrators, merchants in royal clothing. They could manage grain shipments and sign trade agreements, but they could not hold a defensive line against a Turkish siege column. They folded at the first sight of Ottoman banners on the horizon. Matthias needed something different. He needed violence with a strategic brain behind it. He needed a weapon that the Ottomans genuinely feared. He went to Visegrad. He unlocked the door. He handed Vlad a sword and pointed him south. The return to Wallachia was not a liberation. It was a delivery. Vlad rode into Târgoviște at the head of a Hungarian military escort, looking down from his horse at the faces of the men who had orchestrated his imprisonment. The same boyar families, the same bloodlines, the sons and nephews and cousins of the men he had impaled 17 years earlier now knelt in the frozen mud before him, pressing their lips to his ring, swearing oaths of undying loyalty to his restored crown. Every word they spoke was a lie, and every man in that courtyard knew it. The boyars were already calculating. They kissed the ring with one hand and sent messengers south with the other. Vlad understood this with the clinical detachment of a man who has spent 14 years staring through glass. He possessed no illusions about loyalty. He possessed no illusions about survival. The arithmetic of his situation was brutally transparent. He had a crown, but he had no army of his own. The forces assembled around him were a patchwork of borrowed and hostile elements, Hungarian mercenaries who fought exclusively for payment and whose contracts could be renegotiated by anyone with deeper pockets. Wallachian conscripts raised and commanded by boyar captains whose loyalty to the throne extended exactly as far as their financial interest in its occupant. Every officer in his camp, every cavalry commander, every supply master had a price, and the Ottomans were prepared to pay it, because the Ottoman Sultan was not merely a military opponent. Mehmed the Conqueror operated the most sophisticated economic and logistical empire on the planet. He understood that wars are won not only on battlefields, but in ledgers. The offer he extended to the Wallachian boyars was elegant in its simplicity. Guarantee uninterrupted passage for Ottoman supply convoys across the Danube corridor. Ensure that Wallachia remains a cooperative transit zone rather than a hostile frontier. In return, your estates will be protected. Your trade networks will expand. Your personal fortunes will grow under Ottoman commercial infrastructure. It was a business proposal, not a military ultimatum. And for men who had spent their entire lives measuring value in gold rather than glory, it was irresistible. Vlad represented total disruption to that arrangement. His entire philosophy of rule was built on absolute sovereignty, zero compromise, and the physical destruction of anyone who attempted to subordinate Wallachian independence to foreign economic interests. He refused tribute payments. He burned Ottoman supply depots. He impaled Turkish envoys and displayed their bodies along the border as warnings. Every stake he planted cost the boyars money. Every raid he launched across the Danube disrupted trade routes that had taken the boyar families decades to establish. The Ottomans did not need to march 100,000 soldiers into Wallachia to solve this problem. They simply needed to fund an internal solution. They provided the gold. The boyars provided the proximity. It was a contract killing financed by an empire and executed by a boardroom. The only barrier standing between the conspirators and their target was a contingent of 200 Moldavian soldiers. These men had been sent by Stephen the Great, the Prince of Moldavia and Vlad's cousin. Stephen was arguably the finest military mind in Eastern Europe at the time, and he was no fool. He understood exactly what Vlad was walking into. He did not send raw recruits or ceremonial guards. He sent hardened veterans, men who had fought Ottoman incursions along the Moldavian frontier for years, men who understood forest warfare, night operations, and close-quarters combat in confined spaces. These 200 soldiers were the only men in Vlad's entire camp who did not answer to a boyar paymaster. They formed a dedicated protective ring around the prince at all times. They slept in shifts around his tent. They tested his food for poison. They stood at the entrance of his pavilion with heavy poleaxes and wore reinforced lamellar armor layered with iron plates capable of deflecting a broadsword strike. For a brief window, this human wall kept the assassination at bay. Then came the order that set the final act in motion. In late November, intelligence reports reached the camp that an Ottoman force had been spotted moving near the fortress of Giurgiu, along the frozen southern bank of the Danube. Vlad commanded his army to march south and engage them. Whether the Ottoman force was real or a fabrication planted by the boyars to draw him out of his fortified position remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the result. The march south was the trigger the conspirators had been waiting for. A medieval army on a winter march is a grinding, deafening, miserable organism. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The roads, already primitive, had been transformed by weeks of frost into jagged ridges of frozen mud that cracked under the wheels of the supply wagons and snapped the ankles of the baggage horses. Men marched with their heads bowed against a wind that cut through wool and leather like it was not there. The noise was relentless. Thousands of chainmail hauberks grinding against each other, iron-rimmed wagon wheels screaming over frozen ground, horses snorting clouds of white vapor. In that wall of sound, a man could be stabbed behind a supply cart, and no one 10 paces away would hear the blade enter. The cold itself was a weapon the boyars wielded without lifting a finger. Chainmail does not insulate. It absorbs the temperature of its environment and transfers it directly into the body of the man wearing it. The iron rings became conductors of cold, pulling heat from the core, stiffening the muscles, numbing the fingers. To grip a sword required thick leather gauntlets that destroyed fine motor control. Every hour on that road degraded the combat readiness of the men protecting Vlad. The Moldavian guards were elite soldiers, but they were still human, and the winter was systematically dismantling their ability to fight. The boyars understood this. They were patient. They let the cold do the preliminary work. Vlad rode at the head of the column and felt the trap assembling around him with every mile. A commander of his experience could read the signs the way a sailor reads the ocean before a storm. Orders were being acknowledged a fraction too slowly. Wallachian cavalry units were drifting wider on the flanks than standard formation required, creating gaps in the line that had no tactical justification. The boyar captains were adjusting spacing, quietly repositioning their men, pulling them away from the Moldavian corps guard with the subtle precision of chess pieces being moved into striking position. They were isolating the target, cutting the Moldavians away from the rest of the army, the way wolves separate a single animal from the herd. So why did he keep riding? Why does a man who can see the jaws closing around him continue walking into the mouth? Because every alternative was worse. Turning back to the capital meant a siege without adequate provisions, trapped inside walls surrounded by enemies both outside and within. Retreating to Hungary meant surrendering himself to the cage at Visegrad, and Vlad had sworn, in the silence of those 14 years, that he would die on his feet before he lived on his knees again. The only path that offered even a sliver of possibility was forward. If he could reach the Ottoman lines and force a chaotic, violent engagement, the confusion of battle might neutralize the conspiracy. In close combat, his personal lethality and his Moldavian guards' discipline could tip the balance. He was gambling everything on one desperate charge into the unknown. It was not a strategy. It was the final option of a man who had already accepted his death and was simply choosing the terms. The forest of Wallachia rose ahead of them like a wall, dense, ancient woodland, choked with undergrowth and crossed by narrow trails that forced the army column to stretch thin, losing all structural cohesion. It was the worst possible terrain for a force trying to maintain defensive integrity. Visibility dropped to nothing. The thick canopy blocked the weak winter sun and plunged the trail into a permanent gray half-light, where shapes dissolved into shadows 20 yards away. The ground was uneven, tangled with roots and frozen brush that caught at boots and hooves. For an army trying to stay together, it was a nightmare. For men planning an ambush, it was perfect. The Wallachian vanguard, commanded entirely by boyar officers, accelerated ahead without waiting for orders. They pulled away from the center of the column and vanished into the trees. Simultaneously, the Hungarian mercenaries at the rear slowed their wagons to a crawl, letting the gap between themselves and the Moldavian guard widen with every passing minute. It was coordinated, precise. Within the span of an hour, the army had fractured into 3 separate segments, and the middle segment, Vlad, and his 200 Moldavians, was completely isolated in the heart of the forest, with no line of sight to either the vanguard or the rearguard, swallowed by timber and silence. In a moment like that, when the geometry collapses and the numbers turn lethal, the only thing that stands between a man and annihilation is the loyalty of the soldiers standing at his shoulder. Vlad looked at his Moldavians and saw men who understood exactly what was happening. They were not confused. They were not panicking. They tightened their grips on their poleaxes. They closed ranks around his horse. They formed a schiltron, a dense moving wall of iron and wood, and they locked eyes with the tree line. They knew the boyars had been bought. They knew the Hungarians would not come. They knew they were going to die in this forest. And they chose to stand anyway. That kind of loyalty is not purchased with gold. It is not manufactured by propaganda. It is forged in shared suffering and sealed by a bond that transcends calculation. We have built something similar here. I want to invite you to join the channel membership, The Lineage. By joining The Lineage, you stop being a spectator watching from the outside. You step into the inner circle. You become part of the team that ensures these investigations are funded, researched, and produced at the highest level. This project survives because of the people who stand with it. In return, you get exclusive access to new documentaries before anyone else sees them, behind-the-scenes content, and a direct hand in shaping what comes next. If you respect the truth buried beneath the myths, and you want to stand on the front line with us, click the Join button now. Step into the lineage. The column stopped. The forward scouts had not reported back. In the stillness of the Wallachia forest, The only sounds were the labored breathing of the horses and the slow creak of frozen leather saddles shifting under the weight of armored men. Vlad raised his hand, and the Moldavian captain responded instantly, barking commands in a low voice that carried just far enough to reach his men without echoing through the trees. The schiltron tightened, shields locked, poleaxes angled outward, presenting a wall of bladed steel to the darkening woods on every side. Vlad drew his sword. The blade cleared the scabbard with a clean metallic ring that cut through the silence like a crack of thunder in an empty cathedral. The steel caught the last gray light filtering through the canopy and held it for a moment, a thin line of cold fire in the darkness. He did not look ahead toward the supposed Ottoman threat that had drawn them into this forest. He turned his horse slowly, deliberately, and faced backward. He stared into the shadows of his own column, into the woods where his own men had vanished, into the darkness that had swallowed the soldiers who had knelt before him and kissed his ring. Then a horn split the air. Not the deep, rolling blast of an Ottoman war horn, not the brass signal of a Hungarian cavalry charge. It was the high, sharp, unmistakable note of a Wallachian hunting horn. The sound hunters use when the prey has been cornered and the killing can begin. The tree line exploded. Arrows came first, but not from the distance. They were fired at close range from both flanks simultaneously, punching through the air at flat trajectories designed for penetration, not arc. The Wallachian cavalry erupted from the underbrush on both sides of the trail. Horses crashed through the frozen brush. The riders did not scream. They did not announce themselves with battle cries or war chants. They came in silence, with the cold mechanical efficiency of men executing a contract. Swords drawn, lances leveled, eyes fixed on the tight cluster of Moldavian guards surrounding the man on the horse in the center of the formation. The killing in the snow had begun. History is not recorded by those who lived it. It is manufactured by those who survived it. And for 5 centuries, the accepted version of how Vlad III died was written by a man whose salary depended on making sure the truth never surfaced. The primary source that shaped everything the Western world believed about the Impaler's final moments came from the pen of Antonio Bonfini, a court chronicler employed directly by King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Bonfini was not a journalist. He was not an independent scholar pursuing truth across the archives of Eastern Europe. He was a paid narrative architect whose job was to make his employer look wise, just, and blameless in the eyes of history. Every sentence Bonfini committed to parchment passed through the filter of political utility before it reached the page. And the story he constructed around the death of Vlad III is one of the most elegant pieces of disinformation produced in the medieval period. According to Bonfini's account, the death was an accident, a tragic miscalculation on a chaotic battlefield. The narrative goes like this. Vlad, eager to observe the progress of an engagement against an Ottoman patrol near the southern frontier, rode to the crest of a low hill to survey the terrain. In the confusion of the skirmish, his own vanguard soldiers, unable to distinguish his silhouette from that of a Turkish officer at distance, drove a lance through his chest. Friendly fire, a battlefield tragedy. No conspiracy, no treason. Just the fog of war consuming a man who had placed himself too close to the action. It is clean, it is digestible, and it collapses the moment you subject it to even the most basic scrutiny. Start with the logistics of the supposed Ottoman threat. A foreign military force operating in Wallachia in late December 1476 would face conditions that make sustained field operations nearly impossible. An army large enough to pose a genuine tactical threat requires massive logistical infrastructure simply to exist in the field during winter. Thousands of pounds of grain and dried fodder per day just to keep the cavalry horses from starving. Large, sustained fire pits every night to prevent the infantry from dying of exposure in their sleep. Supply wagons, medical provisions, foraging parties, scouts. You do not move that kind of apparatus through the frozen woodlands of southern Wallachia without leaving a trail visible to every border militia, every village lookout, every mounted patrol within 50 miles. The idea that a meaningful Ottoman strike force materialized silently in the forests near Giurgiu, engaged the Wallachian prince, killed him by accident, and then evaporated back across the Danube without any sustained pursuit or follow-up engagement is not improbable. It is operationally absurd. Now, consider the defensive architecture surrounding Vlad at the time of his supposed accidental death. He was encircled at all times by 200 elite Moldavian bodyguards. These were not ceremonial attendants carrying decorative weapons. These were professional soldiers selected and deployed by Stephen the Great of Moldavia, one of the most capable military commanders in 15th century Europe. Their singular purpose was the physical protection of Vlad's person. They maintained a perimeter around him during marches, during encampments, and during engagements. The idea that a random Turkish detachment somehow penetrated this ring struck the prince and withdrew without triggering a sustained defensive response from 200 men whose entire mission was to prevent exactly that scenario does not survive contact with reality. The Moldavians did not fail because an enemy got through. The Moldavians were overwhelmed because the enemy was already inside the formation. The truth is that the boyars had been engineering this outcome for months. The operational plan was precise, patient, and built on a foundation of financial incentive that made cooperation among the conspirators almost inevitable. They already had the replacement prince selected, vetted, and standing by. His name was Basarab Laiota. He came from the rival Danish branch of the Wallachian royal lineage, a man who possessed no inconvenient ideological commitments to sovereignty or independence. Laiota understood what the boyars needed: a prince who would sign the Ottoman trade agreements, a prince who would reopen the Danube transit corridors, a prince who would collect his comfortable percentage and ask no questions about where the larger profits flowed. He was the perfect instrument, a rubber stamp wrapped in royal robes. But installing Laiota required a vacancy on the throne, and that vacancy had to be created under conditions that allowed the conspirators to control every aspect of the narrative that followed. The assassination could not happen in Targovishte. The capital had too many variables: urban militias, loyalist factions among the lower nobility, and the merchant class who benefited from Vlad's economic policies. Palace servants and guards whose testimony could contradict the official version of events. A killing in the city risked witnesses, resistance, and civil unrest. The assassination had to happen in a place where the only people present were people on the payroll. It had to happen in the wilderness. The march south toward the reported Ottoman position at Giurgiu provided exactly that. Whether the Ottoman sighting was real or a fabricated piece of intelligence planted specifically to draw Vlad out of his fortified position is a question that historians have debated for centuries without resolution. What is beyond debate is the outcome. The march pulled Vlad away from the walls of the capital, away from any potential loyalist intervention, and delivered him into the geographic isolation of the Wallachia forest, surrounded on all sides by men who had already agreed to kill him. The attack itself was designed as organized chaos. When the Wallachian cavalry turned inward against the Moldavian guard, they did not execute a conventional mounted charge. The dense, ancient timber of the Wallachia forest made that impossible. The trees stood too close together. The undergrowth was too thick. A horse at full gallop in that environment would shatter its legs on hidden roots within seconds. Instead, the boyar cavalry dismounted at the edge of the tree line and advanced on foot, moving through the timber in coordinated groups, closing the net around the stranded Moldavian perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. They used the environment itself as a weapon. The narrow trails, the limited visibility, the suffocating closeness of the forest that turned a defensive ring into a cage. The temperature was devastating, far below freezing, deep enough to transform the physical capabilities of every man standing in that clearing. The snow on the forest floor was a foot deep in places, crusted on the surface from days of freeze-thaw cycles, but soft and treacherous underneath, concealing roots, rocks, fallen branches, and the frozen ruts of old animal trails that could snap an ankle or trap a boot at the worst possible moment. Moving through that snow in full armor was exhausting. Fighting in it was a nightmare. Every step required effort. Every swing of a weapon had to account for the uncertain footing beneath. The physical toll of the cold on the human body in combat conditions is something that modern audiences profoundly underestimate. A chainmail hauberk is constructed from thousands of interlocking iron rings. Iron is a thermal conductor. In sub-zero temperatures, it does not merely fail to insulate the body. It actively drains heat from the torso, pulling warmth through the padded gambeson beneath and radiating it into the frozen air. The men standing in the center of that forest were already fighting the preliminary stages of hypothermia before the first blow was struck. Their muscles were sluggish. Their reaction times were degraded. Their fingers, encased in thick, boiled leather gauntlets designed to prevent frostbite, had lost the fine motor precision needed to execute rapid weapon transitions or grip adjustments during close-quarters fighting. The cold was not an incidental detail of the setting. It was a strategic element the boyars had factored into their calculations from the beginning. Every hour on the march had eroded the defensive capability of the Moldavian Guard. Every degree the temperature dropped gave the attackers an incremental advantage, because the attackers knew the ambush was coming. They knew when the violence would start. They could pace themselves. The defenders could not. When the hunting horn split the silence of the forest, the adrenaline response hit both sides simultaneously. But its effects were radically different for the men prepared for the fight versus the men who were not. The Moldavians experienced the full physiological shock of sudden ambush. Heart rates spiking, blood rushing from the core to the extremities, muscles flooding with oxygen and glucose in a survival response that burns at an unsustainable rate. The body can maintain peak combat output under maximum adrenaline for approximately 90 seconds to 3 minutes before lactic acid accumulates in the muscle tissue, turning the arms leaden and the lungs into furnaces. The attackers, who had positioned themselves calmly in the tree line for minutes or hours before the signal, entered the fight at a controlled pace. They had the advantage of initiative. They chose the moment. And in medieval infantry combat, the side that chooses the moment almost always wins. The first contact was a collision of steel and human architecture. The boyar mercenaries carried weapons selected specifically for the environment. Short arming swords, flanged maces, war hammers with reinforced steel heads designed to concentrate force into a narrow striking surface capable of denting plate armor and fracturing the skull beneath it. These were close-quarters tools, built for the confined claustrophobic dimensions of a forest melee, where a 6-foot poleaxe becomes as much a liability as an advantage if the enemy closes the distance. The Moldavians, however, were not ordinary infantry. They had trained with poleaxes in exactly these conditions. A 15th-century poleaxe is a devastating instrument, a shaft of dense, polished ashwood topped with a complex steel head, combining a spear point for thrusting, an axe blade for hooking and cutting, and a dense hammerhead for delivering crushing blows through armored plate. In the hands of a trained professional, it could collapse a helmet, shatter a collarbone, or punch through a breastplate at a range that kept the wielder outside the reach of a shorter weapon. When the first wave of attackers hit the Moldavian perimeter, the defenders answered with controlled, horizontal sweeps that turned the forest into a killing zone. The sound of an iron hammerhead connecting with a steel helmet is not the cinematic ring of a sword fight. It is a flat, wet, concussive crack, like a ceramic pot dropped onto stone. Men dropped where they stood, skulls fractured, brains hemorrhaging into the space between bone and metal. The snow around the perimeter turned dark within seconds. Bodies piled at the base of the Moldavian line, creating obstacles that the next wave of attackers had to climb over, stumble through, or push aside before they could close the distance. The Moldavians fought without words. No war cries, no rallying calls. They operated with the silent, mechanical discipline of men who had accepted the mathematics of their situation and chosen to convert their remaining minutes of life into the maximum possible cost for the enemy. But mathematics cannot be defeated by courage alone. The attackers kept coming. The boyars had committed enough men to absorb the initial casualties and maintain constant pressure on every side of the shrinking perimeter. In a dense infantry melee, the experience of fighting is not the romanticized clash of individual duels. It is a crushing, suffocating press of bodies, chest to chest, shoulder to shoulder. The stench of sweat and unwashed wool and blood, and the hot, sour breath of the man trying to work a dagger tip into the gap between your helmet and your gorget. The noise is overwhelming. Steel scraping on steel, grunting. The thick, wet sound of edged weapons entering flesh. The screams of the wounded, muffled by the press of bodies around them. Footing is everything in this environment, and footing was the first casualty. The snow underfoot had been churned into a dark red slurry of blood, melted ice, and frozen dirt. The iron-shod boots of the combatants could find no purchase on that surface. Men slipped, and in a dense melee, a man who falls does not get up. He is trampled by the boots of both sides, crushed under the weight of collapsing bodies, stabbed by men who cannot even see what they are striking in the press below knee level. One by one, the Moldavians fell. A flanged mace caved in a shoulder, disabling the arm that held the poleaxe. A thrusting blade found the gap at the armpit, where the lamellar plates did not overlap. A war hammer struck a knee from the side, shattering the joint and dropping the defender into the bloody snow, where he was finished with daggers. The perimeter contracted with each man lost. The circle around Vlad tightened, compressed, and began to buckle under the sheer mass of bodies pressing inward from every direction. The attackers were not attempting to engage the Moldavians in sustained combat. They were using volume, throwing bodies at the ring until the structural integrity of the formation collapsed under accumulated damage and exhaustion. Vlad stood at the center of this disintegrating circle. He had fought in wars across 3 decades. He understood the physiology of prolonged combat with the clinical precision of a man who had watched thousands die. He knew that the burning in his guard's arms meant the lactic acid had taken hold. He knew that the slowing of their swings meant the energy reserves were depleted. He knew that the gaps appearing in the formation were not tactical adjustments. They were the symptoms of a defensive structure in its final moments of failure. The weapons striking the Moldavian shields carried the heraldic markings of his own Wallachian units. The armor on the attackers bore the insignias of his own court officers. This was not an Ottoman ambush discovered by a surprised patrol. This was a coordinated internal execution carried out by the men who had sworn loyalty to him less than 2 months earlier. The end came the way these things always come. Not in a grand cinematic confrontation between the prince and a worthy adversary. Not in a dramatic last stand on a hilltop with a sword raised against the sky. It came in the mud. The surviving forensic evidence, what little exists after 5 centuries of deliberate obfuscation, points to a close-quarters killing. As the Moldavian ring buckled and the attackers breached the inner perimeter, someone reached Vlad. The blow was not theatrical. It was efficient. A blade entering through one of the structural vulnerabilities that exist in every suit of armor, regardless of its quality. The armpit, the groin, the back of the neck where the helmet meets the gorget. An upward thrust, angled to bypass the plates and penetrate the soft tissue beneath. The point severed arterial pathways. The blood loss was immediate and catastrophic. Vlad went down into the red snow. The man who had ordered the impalement of tens of thousands, the man who had made empires flinch at the mention of his name, died choking on his own blood in an unmarked clearing in the woods, killed not by a foreign conqueror, but by the servants of his own court. The biology of death by arterial hemorrhage on a frozen battlefield follows a precise and merciless sequence. The moment the major vessels were severed, Vlad entered hypovolemic shock. Blood pressure collapsed. The heart, suddenly pumping against a system that could no longer maintain volume, raced and then faltered. The cold ground beneath him accelerated the thermal loss from his core, pulling whatever residual heat remained in his body into the frozen earth. His vision would have narrowed to a shrinking tunnel as the brain, starved of oxygenated blood, began shutting down its peripheral functions. The sounds of the massacre around him, the crunching of boots in the snow, the splintering of wood, the guttural sounds of men dying, would have dissolved into a distant, formless hum. He did not deliver a final speech. He did not utter a legendary last phrase. He bled into the dirt like every other soldier who has ever fallen in a fight that history decided to remember differently than it happened. The killing stopped the instant the target was confirmed dead. The surviving attackers stepped back from the carnage, breathing in ragged white plumes, their weapons dripping in the freezing air. The remaining Moldavians were executed where they stood or where they lay. Every single one. The boyars could not afford witnesses. Not one man from that 200-strong guard could be allowed to survive and carry an account of what had actually happened in this forest to Stephen the Great in Moldavia, or to any foreign court that might use the truth as a political weapon against the conspirators. The wounded were speared through the chest. The men attempting to crawl into the undergrowth were dragged back by their ankles and had their throats cut. The execution of the witnesses was as systematic and as thorough as the assassination of the prince himself. When the last Moldavian stopped moving, the forest fell into a silence so complete that the only remaining sound was the wind passing through the bare branches above the dead. Then the operational phase began. The boyars had not come to this forest merely to kill a prince. They had come to collect a delivery. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, had placed a bounty on Vlad's head. Not a metaphorical bounty, a literal one. He wanted the physical head of the impaler delivered to Constantinople as verifiable proof of death. The Sultan had been humiliated by Vlad on multiple occasions. The night attack of 1462, when Vlad had infiltrated the Ottoman camp with a strike force and nearly killed Mehmed in his own tent, had become a source of enduring personal rage. This was not merely a geopolitical transaction. It was a personal vendetta underwritten by imperial treasury. Decapitating a human body with a battlefield weapon is a task that the modern imagination, conditioned by cinematic depictions of clean, instantaneous severance, fundamentally misunderstands. A sword is designed to cut flesh and muscle in slicing motions. It is not designed to chop through the cervical vertebrae, the dense connective tissue, the layered muscle groups that protect the spinal column at the base of the skull. The man assigned to this task had to kneel in the blood-saturated snow beside the corpse. He grabbed Vlad by the hair, pulled the head backward to extend and expose the throat, and brought a heavy blade down into the neck. The first stroke opened the windpipe and severed the carotid arteries. Blood, still warm from residual body heat, poured across the assassin's gauntlets and into the snow. The blade struck the cervical spine and stopped. He had to wrench the edge sideways, using leverage and body weight to force the steel through the ligaments and cartilage surrounding the vertebrae. The connective tissue resisted. He twisted. He sawed. The final separation of the spinal cord produced a sound that carried through the silent clearing. He lifted the head by its matted hair. The body's remaining blood supply drained from the open stump of the neck onto the frozen ground in slow, thickening pulses. What happened next reveals the depth of premeditation behind the entire operation. The assassins had brought a large ceramic vessel into the forest, not a battlefield container, not a canteen or a water jug. A specially prepared preservation jar, sealed with heavy wax, designed for a single purpose. Inside the jar was thick, golden honey. In the 15th century, honey was the most effective preservation medium available for biological tissue. It is a natural antimicrobial agent. Its low moisture content and high sugar concentration create an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause decomposition. Submerged in honey, organic material can remain intact for weeks, even months. The conspirators knew the head had to survive a journey of approximately 300 miles south to Constantinople. They knew the Sultan required a trophy that was recognizable. The face had to be intact. The features had to be identifiable. A decomposed, unrecognizable mass of tissue would not satisfy the contract. But honey in sub-zero temperatures is nearly solid. It does not pour. It does not flow. It sits in the jar like thick amber stone. To use it, the assassins had to build a fire in the clearing. They gathered dead wood from the forest floor, stacked it beside the headless corpse of their sovereign, and lit a blaze large enough to warm the ceramic vessel until the honey softened into a viscous liquid. Consider the scene. A dozen men standing around a campfire in a forest clearing, littered with 200 dead soldiers, patiently waiting for a jar of honey to reach working temperature so they could submerge the severed head of their prince. They rubbed their hands over the flames. They stamped their feet against the cold. They may have eaten from their provisions while they waited. The methodical calm of this moment is more disturbing than the violence that preceded it. Violence can be explained by adrenaline, by fear, by the chaos of combat. But standing over a mutilated corpse, warming honey by a fire, requires a specific kind of detachment that only emerges when the act has been rehearsed, discussed, and agreed upon long before the first blade was drawn. When the honey reached the right consistency, they lowered Vlad's head into the vessel. The thick golden liquid displaced the air, filling the open mouth, flowing into the nostrils, coating the surface of the still open eyes. They pressed the head down until it was fully submerged. Then they sealed the lid with hot wax, ensuring an airtight closure that would maintain the preservation environment throughout the long journey south. The Sultan had commissioned a product. The cartel delivered it with professional precision. The fact that this equipment was present in the forest at all demolishes any remaining pretense that the death was accidental or spontaneous. You do not carry a heavy, fragile ceramic jar filled with expensive preservation fluid on a routine winter patrol. You do not bring specialized packaging materials to a skirmish against a rumored Ottoman raiding party. You bring them to a prearranged execution where the schedule, the location, and the desired deliverable have been agreed upon in advance. The honey jar is the smoking gun of the conspiracy. It is the physical proof that every element of this operation, from the forged intelligence about the Ottoman force at Giurgiu to the fragmentation of the army column in the Wallachia forest to the final assault on the Moldavian Guard, was planned, coordinated, and resourced before the march south ever began. With the trophy secured, the boyars turned to the administrative machinery of their coup. They stripped the dead of anything valuable. Vlad's armor, his weapons, the signet rings, the royal seal. The fine steel and hardened leather worn by the Moldavian captains was pulled from their cooling bodies and distributed among the boyar officers as spoils. In the medieval economy, quality armor represented a fortune. A single suit of reinforced lamellar could be worth more than a year's income for a common soldier. The dead were picked clean with the efficiency of men who understood the accounting of war, down to the last iron buckle. A mounted messenger was dispatched north to the Hungarian court before the bodies in the clearing had finished cooling. He carried a written report addressed to King Matthias Corvinus. The report stated that Prince Vlad III had fallen during a surprise engagement with an Ottoman raiding party near the southern border. Killed in action, a heroic death in service of the Christian defense of the Danube frontier. The lie was committed to parchment and sealed with official crests before the blood in the forest had frozen solid. It would reach Matthias within days, and Matthias, who had his own reasons for wanting Vlad permanently removed from the political landscape, would accept the report without investigation. The convenient fiction served everyone at the table. Basarab Laiota was proclaimed the new Prince of Wallachia before the week was out. He rode into Targovishte with a boyar escort, sat on the throne Vlad had reclaimed barely 2 months earlier, and immediately began signing the trade agreements and tribute arrangements that the Impaler had spent his entire reign resisting. Ottoman supply convoys crossed the Danube without interference. Tax revenues flowed south to Constantinople. The boyar estates were confirmed and expanded. The commercial machinery that Vlad had disrupted was restored to full operation within a matter of weeks. The corporate restructuring was complete. The disruptive CEO had been removed and replaced with a compliant executive who understood his role was to sign documents and collect his percentage. To truly understand the full depth of this conspiracy and the forensic details that standard histories deliberately omit, you need to go beyond what any single documentary can cover. The primary source material that formed the foundation of this investigation is available right now through the View Products button on your screen. This is not a casual read. It is a monolithic archive of primary documents, original translations, and forensic analysis that strips away the centuries of myth and exposes the raw mechanics of medieval political assassination as they actually functioned. You need this volume if you want to understand not just what happened to Vlad, but how the system that killed him operated at every level. Alongside this foundational text, we have curated a selection of additional artifacts on the shop shelf. I will not reveal what is waiting inside. Explore it yourself. Discover what has been assembled for those who want to go deeper. While we continue our descent into the snow, the sealed jar began its journey south along the frozen roads toward Constantinople. The boyars mounted their horses, formed their columns, and rode back toward the capital to begin the work of governing under their new, obedient prince. The forest of Wallachia settled back into its winter silence. Fresh snow began to fall within hours, layering white over the churned red mud, the shattered poleaxe shafts, the broken bodies of 200 Moldavian soldiers who had died keeping a promise they knew would cost them everything. But the conspirators had left a problem behind. A flaw in the architecture of their perfect crime that would haunt the historical record for the next 5 centuries. They took the head. They needed it. The Sultan demanded it. But the body remained. The heavy, headless corpse of Vlad III lay on the floor of that forest clearing. And a dead prince is one of the most dangerous objects in the medieval political universe. Leave it for the wolves, and you risk a loyalist patrol finding the bones and constructing a martyr's shrine that becomes a rallying point for rebellion. Bury it in an unmarked grave, and you risk the grave being discovered, the remains being identified, and the real story of the assassination being pieced together from the physical evidence. Display it publicly, and you admit to regicide. Every option carried risk. Every option left a trace. The body vanished. When the snow melted and spring returned to the Wallachia forest, the clearing was empty. No grave, no remains, no marker. The headless corpse of the most feared ruler in European history simply ceased to exist. Where the boyars hid the remains of the Impaler is a question that has consumed historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters for over 500 years. And the answer, when it finally surfaces, may be darker than the murder itself. A headless corpse weighing close to 200 pounds does not evaporate. It does not melt into the earth. It does not resolve itself into silence simply because the men who created it wish it would. When the boyar commanders rode out of the Wallachia forest with their sealed jar and their blood-stained silver, they left behind a problem that no amount of Ottoman gold could solve by itself. The body of a sovereign, even a desecrated one, possesses a gravitational force that outlasts the flesh it inhabits. A dead prince is not merely a corpse. It is a political instrument. In the wrong hands, it becomes a relic, a rallying cry, a symbol around which the scattered remnants of loyalty can reconstitute themselves into something the conspirators could not afford: rebellion. The boyars understood this with the same transactional clarity they applied to every other variable in their operation. The peasantry of Wallachia, the same population that had suffered under Vlad's reign of impalement, had also been the primary beneficiaries of his economic policies. He had crushed the merchant cartels that fixed grain prices. He had executed the tax collectors who skimmed the revenue meant for village infrastructure. He had, in his violent and uncompromising way, forced a version of order onto a country that had known nothing but exploitation under boyar management for generations. The common people feared him, but they also recognized that his reign was the only period in living memory when the powerful suffered consequences for their corruption. If those people found his body, they would not see a dead tyrant. They would see a martyr. And martyrs, in the medieval world, generate shrines. Shrines generate pilgrimages. Pilgrimages generate communities. Communities generate armies. The body had to disappear. Completely. Permanently. Without a trace that could be followed, exhumed, or venerated. The task was assigned to a small detachment of mercenaries selected for their discretion and their indifference to the sacred. These were not men who would hesitate at the threshold of a church. They remained behind in the freezing clearing after the main boyar column had departed, working in the gray pre-dawn light with the efficient, emotionless pace of men completing a contracted job. They brought a wooden cart, not a military transport, a livestock cart, the kind used by butchers to haul slaughtered animals from the killing floor to the market. The symbolism may have been incidental, it may have been deliberate. With the boyars, it was often impossible to distinguish operational convenience from calculated humiliation. They stripped the remaining armor and clothing from the corpse, reducing the Prince of Wallachia to bare, stiffening flesh. The cold had already begun its work on the muscle tissue. Rigor mortis in sub-zero temperatures accelerates dramatically. The limbs were locking into the positions they had occupied at the moment of death, creating rigid, angular shapes that resisted manipulation. The mercenaries had to force the body onto the cart, bending frozen joints with brute leverage, folding the frame of one of the most feared men in European history over the rough wooden slats like a side of processed meat. They threw heavy canvas tarps over the load, lashed them down with rope, and drove the cart north, away from the main roads, away from the trade routes where witnesses might observe the cargo, deeper into the desolate, frozen marshlands that spread across the low country north of the Wallachia forest. Their destination was a place deliberately chosen for its isolation, its silence, and its spiritual authority: the island monastery of Snagov. Snagov sat in the center of a dark, still lake, accessible only by boat or, in the depths of winter, across ice thick enough to bear the weight of a loaded cart. It was an ancient foundation, centuries old by the time Vlad's corpse arrived at its shores. A brick sanctuary surrounded by freezing water, populated by a small community of Orthodox monks who sustained themselves on fish pulled from the lake, and the intermittent charity of regional lords. The monastery was isolated by design. It existed outside the currents of commerce and politics that defined Wallachian life. It was a place where things could be hidden from the world with reasonable confidence that the world would never come looking. The mercenaries arrived in darkness. The heavy wooden doors of the monastery church were forced open. The confrontation between armed men carrying a headless corpse and a community of unarmed monks dedicated to prayer and contemplation is not recorded in any surviving document with the specificity that historians would prefer. But the architecture of the encounter is self-evident. Armed men carrying the body of a murdered prince do not knock politely and request a meeting with the abbot. They enter. They issue instructions. The monks comply, because the alternative to compliance, in a country where the men giving orders have just demonstrated their willingness to decapitate a sovereign, does not require elaboration. The monks were ordered to open the stone floor of the church and prepare a burial site. But what followed reveals that the conspirators were not satisfied with simple concealment. They wanted desecration. They wanted to ensure that Vlad's remains, if ever discovered, would carry the permanent stain of dishonor rather than the sanctity of martyrdom. In the Orthodox Christian tradition, a prince who had funded the construction and restoration of monasteries during his lifetime, as Vlad had done extensively, earned the right to burial in the position of highest honor within the church. That position is directly in front of the main altar, the sacred axis of the sanctuary, the precise spot where the priest stands to deliver the liturgy and consecrate the Eucharist. To be buried before the altar is to be placed at the symbolic center of communion between the human and the divine. It is the ultimate acknowledgement of a ruler's spiritual legacy. The mercenaries were aware of this tradition. They instructed the monks to prepare the altar tomb. They placed a stone slab over it, creating every outward appearance of an honorable burial. They did not put the body inside it. The empty tomb was a trap, a decoy designed with meticulous cruelty. If anyone came looking for the Impaler's remains, if loyalists or future generations of scholars, or even the monks themselves attempted to honor his memory, they would find an empty grave in the position of highest sanctity. The absence would create confusion, doubt, a theological void where a relic should have been. The conspirators understood that an empty tomb at the altar would generate centuries of speculation, misdirection, and ultimately the slow erosion of certainty about whether Vlad had ever been buried at Snagov at all. The emptiness itself was a weapon. It turned the search for truth into an infinite loop. The actual remains, or whatever portion of them the mercenaries chose to deposit, were placed elsewhere, near the back of the church, near the entrance doors. In the theology of Orthodox burial architecture, this placement carries a specific and devastating meaning. A body buried at the threshold of a church is positioned so that every person who enters the sanctuary walks directly over the grave. Every monk processing to morning prayers, every peasant attending a feast day service, every visiting dignitary arriving for an inspection. Their boots grind into the stone above the buried remains, pressing dirt and mud and the filth of the road into the memory of the dead. It is not merely a low-status burial. It is a spatial curse, a deliberate inversion of honor, designed to ensure that the occupant of the grave is symbolically trampled for eternity by the living. The full scope of this desecration would not be confirmed until 4.5 centuries later. In the summer of 1933, a Romanian archaeologist named Dinu Fai Rossetti organized a formal excavation of the Snagov monastery floor. The site had accumulated centuries of folklore. Local village traditions, passed orally from generation to generation through families who had lived in the shadow of the monastery's lake for as long as anyone could remember, insisted that the Impaler lay beneath the stones. Rossetti secured institutional funding, assembled a team of laborers equipped with iron picks, heavy shovels, and the patient discipline required for forensic archaeology, and entered the dim, incense-darkened interior of the church. He began where any scholar following the historical logic would begin. At the altar, the stone slab in front of the sanctuary bore no inscription, but its placement corresponded precisely to the traditional position reserved for a founding patron or a prince of significant ecclesiastical standing. The laborers drove iron wedges into the mortar surrounding the slab. The sharp crack of metal striking stone echoed through the vaulted interior, bouncing off the painted faces of saints staring down from the frescoes above. They inserted thick wooden levers into the widening gaps and applied their weight. The ancient seal resisted, then gave way with a low groan that resonated through the floor. The slab shifted. The men slid it aside, revealing the dark earth beneath. The air that rose from the opened ground carried the distinct dry scent of centuries-old soil. Undisturbed earth has a specific quality that any experienced excavator recognizes immediately. It smells of compressed time, of mineral and root, and the slow chemical transformation of organic matter into geological sediment. The laborers began to dig, carefully at first, sifting the loose soil through their fingers, searching for the telltale fragments that indicate a burial. Bone, fabric, corroded metal, the tarnished remnant of a ring or a clasp. They found nothing. The shovels scraped deeper, past the loose topsoil, into the compacted clay of the foundation layer. Rossetti stood at the edge of the pit, cataloging every stratum, recording the color and consistency of each layer of sediment with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that the absence of evidence is itself a form of evidence. The pit reached a depth of more than a meter. The workers stopped. They looked up at the archaeologist with expressions that communicated what the dirt had already confirmed. The tomb was empty. No coffin, no skeletal remains, no artifacts, no residue of decomposition, no chemical staining in the soil that would indicate a body had ever rested there. The position of highest honor, the grave that tradition and folklore had identified for centuries as the resting place of Vlad III, was a deliberate void, a monument to nothing. The decoy had functioned exactly as designed for 457 years. Rossetti did not accept the empty tomb as the final answer. An archaeologist who stops at the first anomaly is not an archaeologist. He is a tourist. Rossetti understood that an empty grave in a medieval church is not a mystery. It is a message. If the conspirators had gone to the trouble of placing a ceremonial stone over an empty pit at the altar, they had done so to draw attention away from somewhere else. He expanded the search grid. He directed his team to move systematically through the church, probing the floor at regular intervals, testing for inconsistencies in the stonework, variations in the mortar, areas where the paving had been disturbed and reset at a different period than the surrounding surface. They found it near the back of the church, close to the entrance doors. An unmarked stone slab, smaller than the altar tomb, bearing no inscription, no carved cross, no identification of any kind. An anonymous square of rock set into the floor at the precise location where the theology of burial placement dictates maximum dishonor. Every person who had entered the Snagov Monastery Church for the past 5 centuries had walked directly over this stone without knowing what lay beneath it. The laborers pried the slab loose. Almost immediately, the shovels struck something solid. Rossetti descended into the shallow trench with hand tools, a brush, a trowel, the fine instruments of a man who understands that the difference between discovery and destruction is measured in millimeters. He cleared the dark, compacted earth with slow lateral strokes. Bone emerged from the soil, the smooth curve of a cranial structure, the long shaft of a femur, the articulated joints of a rib cage. But the proportions were wrong. Rossetti's trained eye registered the anomaly before his conscious mind had finished processing the visual information. The skull was too elongated. The orbital sockets were positioned too far to the sides of the cranial structure. The femurs were too thick, too dense, angled at a geometry that did not correspond to human bipedal anatomy. The teeth were flat, broad grinding surfaces designed for processing plant fiber, not the differentiated dental architecture of a human mouth. As the full skeleton emerged from the earth, centimeter by centimeter, the reality of the 15th century cover-up materialized in the dim light of the church with a clarity that silenced every man in the room. It was not a prince. It was a horse. The boyars had buried a horse in consecrated ground. In the Orthodox tradition, the burial of an animal within the walls of a church is not merely an irregularity. It is a profound and deliberate act of desecration. It contaminates the sacred space. It violates the theological boundary between the human soul, which is believed to be capable of communion with God, and the animal, which is not. To place the bones of a beast in the same earth that is supposed to cradle the bodies of the faithful is an act of spiritual vandalism so severe that it would have required the full reconsecration of the church if the monks had reported it, which, of course, they did not, because the men who ordered the burial were the same men who had just murdered their prince, and the monks understood, with absolute clarity, that reporting the desecration would result in their own deaths. The symbolism of the horse was not accidental. In the medieval military imagination, the horse was the extension of the warrior. The cavalry commander and his mount were a single unit of destruction. Vlad was, above all else, a mounted commander. His campaigns, his raids across the Danube, his legendary night attacks against Ottoman encampments were all conducted from the saddle. To bury a horse where the prince should have rested was the boyars' final editorial comment on the man they had destroyed. They reduced him to his vehicle. They replaced the sovereign with the beast he rode. They ensured that his spiritual legacy, if anyone ever bothered to dig for it, would be contaminated beyond recovery by the presence of animal remains in what should have been hallowed ground. The empty altar tomb and the horse skeleton at the threshold together form a complete statement. The boyars did not merely kill Vlad, they annihilated his claim to human dignity in the one place where medieval Christian society guaranteed it. The church was supposed to be the final sanctuary, the one institution that stood between a man and total erasure. The conspirators violated even that, but concealing the body and desecrating the burial site was only the first phase of the operation. The second phase was larger, more ambitious, and ultimately more successful than the assassination itself. The boyars and their Hungarian patrons needed to reshape the entire narrative surrounding Vlad's life and death. They needed to transform a political murder into a morality tale. They needed the world to believe that the man they killed deserved to die, not because he threatened their commerce, but because he was a monster who had forfeited his humanity through acts of incomprehensible evil. The diplomatic pressure was immediate and intense. Word of the assassination spread along the trade networks that connected the Balkans to Western Europe with the speed of merchant caravans and diplomatic couriers. In the courts of Rome, Vlad had been celebrated as a champion of Christendom. The Pope viewed him as a frontline asset in the ongoing struggle against Ottoman expansion. He had been publicly praised, financially supported, and held up as an example of Christian martial virtue. The Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, had personally sponsored Vlad's return to the Wallachian throne. He had invested political capital, military resources, and papal goodwill in restoring the Impaler to power. Now Matthias had to explain to the Vatican and to every allied court in Europe why his newly reinstated Crusader prince was dead in a forest, murdered by the very boyar families that Matthias himself had endorsed and empowered. The question was simple and devastating. If the boyars killed Vlad and the boyars answered to Matthias, then who was truly responsible for the death of a Christian champion? Matthias Corvinus was many things: a patron of the arts, a builder of libraries, a shrewd diplomat. Above all, he was a survivor. He recognized, with the instinct of a man who had navigated the treacherous currents of 15th-century European power politics since adolescence, that the truth of the assassination would destroy him. If the Vatican concluded that Matthias had facilitated or permitted the murder of one of its most visible frontline defenders, the flow of papal funding that sustained the Hungarian military apparatus would be severed. The political alliances that kept Hungary positioned as the primary bulwark against Ottoman expansion would collapse. Matthias needed a different story, not a cover-up in the traditional sense, something more sophisticated. He needed to retroactively transform the victim into a villain so monstrous that his death, regardless of who orchestrated it, would be received not as a crime, but as an act of justice. If Vlad the Impaler was a demon, then his assassination was not a betrayal. It was a public service. This is where the conspiracy transcended the physical act of murder and entered the realm of information warfare. What followed was one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in European history, and it was powered by a technology that had only recently become available on a scale capable of reshaping continental public opinion. In 1439, Johannes Gutenberg had refined the movable type printing press in Mainz. By the 1470s, printing operations had spread across the German-speaking territories, establishing themselves in commercial centers like Nuremberg, Strasbourg, Bamberg, and Augsburg. For the first time in human history, identical copies of a document could be produced in quantities that made mass distribution economically viable. Information was no longer confined to hand-copied manuscripts locked in monastery libraries, accessible only to the literate clergy and the highest tiers of the aristocracy. Information could be manufactured, packaged, distributed along the same trade routes that carried silk and spice and salt. The printing press was the 15th century's equivalent of a global broadcast network, and Matthias Corvinus understood its potential with the intuition of a man born to manipulate narratives. The Hungarian court commissioned a series of publications designed to systematically reconstruct Vlad's legacy in the European imagination. Writers, working under the direction of court officials, compiled every account of Vlad's reign that could be sourced from diplomatic dispatches, merchant testimony, military reports, and the embellished oral traditions of the Wallachian border regions. They gathered the raw material of his rule, the impalements, the punishments, the mass executions, and they performed a specific editorial operation on it. They stripped away all context. They removed every reference to the geopolitical conditions that had produced Vlad's methods. They ignored the fact that impalement was a recognized judicial punishment used across multiple European and Ottoman jurisdictions during the same period. They deleted the economic reforms, the anti-corruption campaigns, the defensive strategies that had kept Wallachia independent against impossible odds. What remained after this surgical extraction of context was pure, decontextualized horror. A catalog of atrocities presented without cause, without rationale, without the political framework that would have allowed the reader to understand them as anything other than the acts of a deranged psychopath. These accounts were formatted into pamphlets, short, portable, cheaply produced documents printed on durable paper stock, in standard German, the lingua franca of the Central European merchant classes. The text was crafted for maximum sensory impact. Descriptions of impalement techniques, accounts of mass executions, stories of Vlad dining calmly among forests of impaled victims. The narrative structure of each pamphlet was identical. Present the horror. Amplify the horror. Never explain the horror. The reader was given no lens through which to interpret the violence except moral revulsion. But the true genius of the campaign lay not in the text, but in the images. The pamphlet producers understood a principle that modern media strategists would not formally articulate for another 5 centuries. The majority of the population cannot read. In 15th century Europe, functional literacy was confined to the clergy, the upper nobility, and the merchant administrative class. The peasantry, the urban laborers, the soldiers, the vast majority of the human beings who constituted European public opinion, processed information visually. They needed pictures. The printers commissioned woodcut illustrations. Artists carved scenes into blocks of dense wood with fine chisels, creating raised images that could be inked and pressed onto paper alongside the text. These woodcuts were not subtle. They were designed for maximum psychological penetration. The most famous and widely reproduced image depicted Vlad seated at a table set with fine dishes, eating a meal while surrounded on all sides by a forest of wooden stakes bearing impaled human bodies. The victims were rendered in graphic detail: twisted limbs, contorted faces, the stakes protruding through abdomens and chests. And in the center of this landscape of suffering, Vlad sat composed, serene, cutting his food with a knife, as if the screaming forest of the dying were nothing more than background scenery for his dinner. That single image accomplished more than every word in every pamphlet combined. It bypassed the rational mind entirely and embedded itself directly in the emotional architecture of the viewer. It did not require literacy. It did not require context. It required only a pair of functioning eyes and a human nervous system capable of processing horror. The image was stamped onto the cover pages of the pamphlets, ensuring it was the first thing any potential reader encountered. It became the icon of the campaign, the logo of the lie. The pamphlets spread across Europe with the speed and penetration of an epidemic. They were cheap enough for a market vendor to purchase, sensational enough to guarantee they would be read aloud in taverns and town squares to those who could not read them independently. They were carried along the same trade routes that transported cloth and grain and iron, inserted into the commercial bloodstream of the continent. Within a few years of their initial publication, The story of the bloodthirsty Wallachian tyrant who boiled his enemies alive and drank their blood had become the most widely consumed narrative entertainment in Central Europe. The pamphlets went through multiple print runs. They were copied and adapted by competing printers in different cities. They were translated, embellished, and repackaged for regional audiences. The operation achieved its objective with a completeness that the conspirators themselves probably did not fully anticipate. The geopolitical reality of Vlad's assassination, the Ottoman gold, the boyar trade agreements, the border economics, the forged intelligence, the corporate structure of the conspiracy, all of it was submerged beneath a flood of decontextualized atrocity narratives so voluminous and so emotionally overwhelming that the truth simply could not compete. The public did not want the truth. The truth was complicated. The truth required understanding the economics of the Danube corridor, the taxation structures of the Ottoman tributary system, the internal politics of the Wallachian nobility. The lie was simple. The lie was vivid. The lie had pictures. The lie won. The boyar families who orchestrated the assassination never faced consequences. They thrived. Under the compliant rule of Basarab-Leota and his successors, the commercial infrastructure they had fought to protect expanded and consolidated. Ottoman trade convoys crossed the Danube unmolested. Tribute payments flowed south on schedule. The boyar estates grew. Their children married into the wider networks of the European aristocracy. Their bloodlines propagated through the centuries, carrying wealth accumulated on the foundation of a murdered prince and a perfectly executed cover story. The architects of the conspiracy won the immediate game. They won the generational game. They won the historical game. 5 centuries later, the world still believes their version of events. The final chapter of the cover-up was written 400 years after the assassination by a man who had no idea he was writing it. In the late 19th century, an Irish theater manager named Bram Stoker was conducting research for a novel about a vampire. He was searching for a name, a setting, and a historical foundation that would give his fictional monster a veneer of authenticity. He walked into a library and discovered the translated remnants of those 15th century German pamphlets. He read the decontextualized accounts of impalement and blood. He saw the name, Vlad, Dracula, the son of the dragon. Stoker did not invent the monster. He inherited it. The creature he assembled from those pamphlets and from his own imagination was not a creation ex nihilo. It was the final product of a manufacturing process that had begun in the printing houses of Nuremberg and Bamberg 4 centuries earlier. The vampire in the black cape, the pale aristocrat with the sharp teeth and the bloodlust, and the Transylvanian castle is not a work of fiction. It is the ultimate achievement of the boyar propaganda campaign, the final iteration of a narrative weapon designed to replace a political assassination with a supernatural horror story so compelling that no one would ever think to look beneath it for the truth. Every film adaptation, every Halloween costume, every plastic set of fangs sold in a convenience store, every time a child says the word Dracula, the cover-up succeeds again. The boyars are still winning. They have been winning for 550 years. The mythology they manufactured to hide their crime has become one of the most recognized cultural properties on the planet, generating billions of dollars in entertainment revenue across every medium human beings have invented since the printing press. The men who swung the axes in the Wallachia forest are forgotten. The men who counted the Ottoman silver are forgotten. The monks who buried the horse are forgotten. Only the ghost survives. The ghost they built. The ghost that was designed, from the moment of its inception, to ensure that no one would ever look past the fangs and the cape and the castle and ask the only question that ever mattered. Who paid for the knives? History does not preserve justice. It preserves the narrative of the victors. Vlad III was a brutal, uncompromising military commander who attempted to impose absolute sovereignty on a nation controlled by a criminal syndicate masquerading as an aristocracy. He used methods that were savage, even by the standards of an era defined by savagery. He failed. The syndicate killed him. They erased his burial. They replaced his legacy with a monster. And the world, 5 centuries later, still cannot tell the difference between the man and the myth they built to bury him. Thank you for watching. Until the very end. The algorithm responds to interaction. So if this investigation changed the way you see history, take 1 second to subscribe, press the like button, and share this video with someone who deserves to know the real mechanics behind the myth. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your definitive history destination on YouTube. Look at the video appearing on your screen right now. Click it. Watch it immediately. The past has no end, and this is the mandatory next step in your descent into the dark.